Tammy Belanger was born on February 24, 1976, in Exeter, New Hampshire, and was raised in a quiet suburban neighborhood as the youngest of three children in a closely connected household. Her mother, Patricia Belanger, worked in hospital administration at Exeter Hospital's emergency room, maintaining a structured schedule that supported the family's daily routines. Her father, Nelson Belanger, supervised production at a local waterworks facility, contributing steady oversight and consistency to their home environment. From an early age, Tammy displayed a personality that those around her consistently described as shy and quiet, with a reserved nature that made her cautious in unfamiliar situations. She was not inclined to speak with strangers and rarely initiated conversation outside her immediate circle. She preferred predictable activity patterns, adhered closely to routine, and responded positively to familiarity and structure in her surroundings, reinforcing her reputation as a child who valued order and consistency. At the time of her disappearance in 1984, Tammy stood approximately 4 feet 6 inches tall and weighed around 70 pounds. She had long brown hair styled with distinctive straight-cut bangs across her forehead, a recognizable feature frequently noted by those who knew her. One of her most identifiable physical characteristics was her left eye, which turned slightly outward due to an earlier injury, giving her a unique appearance that distinguished her from other children in her neighborhood and school community. Tammy followed the same morning routine each weekday, preparing for school with structured regularity. She woke early, dressed for the day, ate breakfast, and departed at a consistent time without delay or deviation. Her destination was Lincoln Street School, located less than 1 mile from her home, a distance she had walked repeatedly since the beginning of her school attendance. This route passed through familiar streets and residential areas she knew well. The school's formal policy required any student living within 2 miles of the campus to walk or be transported by a parent, as bus services were unavailable for those residing within that range. Tammy therefore walked independently each morning, following this procedural expectation without hesitation or documented concern. This routine, her temperament, and the regulated expectations of the community framed the setting of her disappearance. Her consistent behavior, identifiable features, and predictable daily movement patterns define the factual circumstances that situate her case squarely within ordinary community structure prior to the unexplained interruption of that established pattern. Her home surroundings reflected ordinary suburban stability, where neighbors were familiar and daily life followed expected residential rhythms shaped by work schedules and school obligations. Tammy's participation in these patterns demonstrated reliability and predictability within her limited childhood world. The consistency of her habits and the clarity of her routine underscored the normalcy that characterized her daily experience, forming a reference point for understanding the moment when her pattern schedule ceased without explanation or visible deviation from her established conduct. On the morning of November 13, 1984, Tammy Belanger left her home around 8 a.m. to begin her customary walk toward Lincoln Street School, following the same familiar route she had taken many times before. She was dressed in an aqua shirt with black and white stripes, layered beneath a purple sweater and a tan jacket with blue sleeves, paired with tan corduroy pants, suede shoes, and green and blue socks. Over her shoulders, she carried a red backpack clearly marked with her name and address, a visible detail that identified her belongings and was consistent with her routine school preparation. As Tammy stepped outdoors and moved down her street, her presence was briefly observed by neighbor Betty Belanger, who saw the child skipping across the roadway a few doors away from the Belanger residence. This observation represents the final confirmed sighting of Tammy on that morning. No other witnesses documented additional interaction with her, and no individuals reported seeing her arrive at the entrance of Lincoln Street School, which remained her intended destination. During the time between her departure and the beginning of classes, no evidence surfaced indicating where Tammy's movement stopped or what circumstances caused her path to change. No direct witnesses observed any confrontation, struggle, or abduction, and there were no reports confirming any vehicle approach or verbal interaction affecting her course. The precise location of her disappearance therefore remained undefined. When classroom attendance was recorded later that day, Tammy was noted as absent, yet no immediate response followed this notation due to procedural limitations common at the time. Schools did not routinely notify parents when students failed to arrive, and there were no automated checks or follow-up communications to confirm her whereabouts during the morning hours. As the day progressed, her absence remained unaddressed within the school system, leaving a critical time window during which no official inquiry was initiated. Tammy did not reach her classroom, and her name remained quietly listed on the absentee record without alert or intervention. This sequence of events established the timeline surrounding her disappearance and confirmed that her routine journey ended somewhere between her home and the school entrance without verified explanation or observable disruption. Throughout this documented time frame, no verified indication was recorded suggesting that Tammy altered her planned route voluntarily or paused at any known location along the way. The absence of immediate observation beyond the brief sighting by Betty Belanger left investigators with only a narrow, confirmed sequence of events. Her departure time, clothing description, and intended destination remain the sole consistent markers defining the morning's progression. No contemporaneous reports established any interaction between Tammy and unfamiliar persons, and no physical trace emerged to clarify where her progress toward the school ceased. The timeline, therefore, remains anchored to her routine departure and the absence notation recorded later that school day within an otherwise ordinary weekday schedule. Tammy Belanger's absence from Lincoln Street School on November 13, 1984, went unnoticed throughout the morning and early afternoon because no formal system existed for notifying parents when students were marked absent from class. Attendance records were completed in the usual manner, and the school day continued without interruption, despite Tammy never arriving at her assigned classroom. At approximately 3:30 p.m., when Tammy failed to return home, her mother Patricia contacted the school to inquire about her whereabouts. During this call, she was informed that Tammy had not been present at any point during the day and had been listed as absent since morning. This confirmation marked the first official recognition that something was wrong and directed immediate attention to her unexplained absence. Following this discovery, Patricia contacted the Exeter Police Department, initiating the formal missing child report and setting the investigative process in motion. By this point, nearly 7.5 hours had passed since Tammy had last been seen leaving her home earlier that morning. This delay represented a critical procedural setback, as the earliest and most valuable window for gathering information and preserving evidence had already closed. Witness recollections that might have been sharper earlier in the day were now potentially diminished, and any immediate physical indicators that could have clarified her route or movements were no longer fresh. The extended gap complicated attempts to trace her path and identify where her routine journey had been interrupted. As law enforcement became involved, organized search efforts began under increasingly challenging conditions. Police officers coordinated with community volunteers to initiate systematic survey operations, establishing search areas and assigning personnel accordingly. These efforts commenced as daylight faded and evening conditions reduced visibility, further complicating field coordination and coverage. The passing hours significantly expanded the geographic range Tammy could possibly have been taken to within that time frame. Investigators recognized that the elapsed interval allowed for substantial movement away from the immediate neighborhood, forcing consideration of a much wider area during initial planning stages. This procedural sequence highlighted the logistical realities associated with missing child cases during that period, particularly the absence of rapid response protocols and immediate attendance verification procedures. The delay fundamentally shaped the investigative landscape, underscoring the seriousness of the challenge confronting those tasked with locating Tammy and reconstructing her unexplained disappearance. Initial coordination required rapid organization of available resources, including allocating personnel to potential travel corridors and documenting timelines established through existing records. Communication between responding officers and available witnesses focused on reconstructing the elapsed period using procedural documentation rather than confirmed visual observations. Although organizational steps progressed according to standard practices of the time, the lack of immediate notification systems continued to impact efficiency. This structured response framed the investigative foundation, highlighting how administrative limitations influence the early hours and shape the expanded scope required to address Tammy's unexplained and unresolved absence during initial evaluation. Search operation began shortly after Tammy Belanger was officially reported missing, marking the start of a coordinated response involving approximately 75 firefighters, police officers, and community volunteers. A Coast Guard helicopter conducted an aerial sweep over the surrounding area while ground teams performed methodical foot patrols through nearby wooded sections and along defined residential pathways. Search personnel also concentrated efforts along riverbanks, conducting systematic marine examinations using boats to inspect water edges and adjacent terrain features. Teams moved through neighborhoods initiating door-to-door inquiries, inspecting backyards, entering accessible buildings, and assessing any indication of disturbed ground within the designated search perimeter. Law enforcement coordinated the removal of an entire street's trash and conducted large-scale sorting and inspection procedures at municipal facilities. Federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, supplemented local efforts by providing additional resources, expertise, and operational support to expand the geographic search range. Despite these comprehensive measures, no physical evidence connected to Tammy was recovered during the extensive search process. Her red backpack, clothing, or any identifiable personal belonging failed to surface during any phase of the investigation. As days passed, the investigation continued with sustained coverage. yet no definitive indicators emerged to clarify her disappearance. Holidays and family milestones occurred during this period, providing reference points for updating operational status reports and documenting investigative progress or lack thereof. Each stage of activity reflected procedural determination while confirming the persistent absence of actionable evidence. Search coordination required logistical planning, careful documentation, and continuous communication between supervisory personnel and deployed field units. Search areas were systematically reassigned to ensure thorough coverage and eliminate redundant overlap. Command structures monitored movement patterns, allocation efficiency, and compliance with procedural guidelines throughout the operation. Investigators documented zones searched, timelines of activity, and procedural outcomes to maintain evidentiary clarity. These records formed a structured account of efforts undertaken during the critical early days of the investigation. Despite expanded manpower and organized execution, the scope of uncertainty remained unchanged. Continued operations reflected the scale of commitment necessary to address the lack of tangible evidence. Law enforcement emphasized procedural thoroughness while acknowledging limitations imposed by time and environmental variables. The ongoing nature of foot patrols, helicopter monitoring, and river inspection illustrated the persistence of structured search methodology. Each operational cycle closed without verified findings, reinforcing the documented absence of confirmatory material. As the investigation advanced, personnel reviewed completed sectors and evaluated whether re-examination was necessary under evolving procedural standards. Detailed reports tracked the timeline of each phase, demonstrating compliance with structured search protocols while underscoring ongoing evidentiary scarcity. These cumulative actions framed the investigative landscape, illustrating comprehensive effort and procedural resolve in the absence of recovered material linking directly to Tammy's location or circumstances. All documented activity remained focused on systematic coverage and precise documentation, maintaining investigative continuity despite the persistent lack of conclusive physical discovery throughout the expanded operational timeline period. Victor Wanetty was formally identified by investigators as a suspect in Tammy Belanger's disappearance following procedural review and background evaluation. At the time, he had been residing in nearby Rye, New Hampshire, a neighboring area situated close to Tammy's community. His presence in the region gained attention after his arrest for a parole violation prompted renewed scrutiny from law enforcement authorities. Victor's documented criminal history became a central point of investigative context. Records confirmed his prior conviction involving the sexual assault of his adolescent stepdaughter, a crime that established a pattern of concerning behavior relevant to investigative review. Authorities maintained a strictly factual approach when presenting this history, using it as contextual information rather than as a determination of responsibility in Tammy's case. Further examination revealed that Victor had previously been arrested in Florida on charges related to prowling activity, which included suspicious conduct near residential areas. This prior incident occurred within months of the disappearance of another 8-year-old child, Marjorie Luna, whose case later became linked through comparative investigative assessment. Investigators identified notable parallels between the two cases. Both children were of similar age and disappeared while walking alone near their respective homes. Law enforcement documented overlap in geographic proximity between Victor's known locations and the areas where both children vanished. These similarities prompted further inquiry and comparison. Additional concern centered on Victor's employment schedule on the morning Tammy disappeared. Records indicated he failed to report to work at his designated time and did not contact his employer until several hours later. This unexplained absence during the precise window of Tammy's routine walk to school was classified as a procedural irregularity requiring documentation and evaluation. Vehicle information provided further points of correlation during investigative review. Witness descriptions in the Florida case included reference to a blue vehicle with observable damage, which investigators later compared to Victor's known automobile characteristics. While these observations did not confirm direct involvement, they contributed to the broader analytical framework guiding law enforcement inquiry. Throughout this process, authorities maintained careful adherence to evidentiary standards, ensuring no speculative conclusions were made. All information regarding Victor remained confined to documented facts, behavioral history, and procedural connections evaluated through official investigative methods. The identification of Victor Wanetty as a suspect represented an evidentiary step rooted in documented circumstances, not confirmed attribution. Investigators continued to assess available information according to structured legal standards while maintaining an objective focus on the development of verified leads. They also reviewed records of his residence in Rye and cross-referenced that location with documented activity timelines from surrounding jurisdictions. This process included verification of parole status compliance and review of employment reporting procedures relevant to the morning in question. Each procedural step remained focused on factual assessment and structured documentation rather than assumption or inference beyond recorded findings and verified observations established by investigators at that time. Supporting administrative records reinforced investigative procedural continuity. Marjorie Luna was an 8-year-old child living in Green Acres, Florida, whose disappearance later became a comparative reference point in ongoing investigative review. Her personal background reflected a common residential setting, and she lived with her family in a neighborhood where daily routines were clearly established and consistently followed. On the day she vanished, Marjorie left her home and walked toward a nearby corner store, completing a short journey she had undertaken many times previously without recorded incident. Her final confirmed movement involved entering the store, where she purchased items and exited shortly afterward, continuing ordinary activity consistent with her known routine. Witnesses at the location later described seeing a man speaking with Marjorie outside the store. Observations included physical characteristics and noted behavior indicating an interaction taking place in the immediate vicinity before her disappearance. The man was described as engaging her briefly while positioned close to the storefront, and his presence was later documented in formal investigative accounts. Following this encounter, no verified sightings confirmed Marjorie's subsequent movements or departure from the area. No confirmed observation established where her path continued, and no evidence clarified the exact moment her routine was interrupted. She did not return home, and her whereabouts remained unknown. Investigators later identified parallels between Marjorie Luna's disappearance and the case of Tammy Belanger. Both children were the same age and had vanished while walking alone near their homes. Each case involved routine neighborhood movement without any recorded indication of forced departure or sudden confrontation. Vehicle descriptions provided by witnesses in the Florida incident included reference to a blue automobile with observable damage, details which investigators compared to similar descriptions noted in Tammy's case documentation. These similarities were treated as points of reference within comparative analysis, not as conclusive linkage. Additionally, investigative review identified proximity between the suspect's known location and the areas from which both children disappeared. Authorities cataloged these observations as factual correlations supporting continued investigation while maintaining procedural obligation to avoid assumptions beyond recorded information. Throughout this process, the narrative surrounding Marjorie Luna's disappearance remains strictly based on observed reporting and documented witness accounts. No physical evidence recovered at the scene clarified her fate, and no direct confirmation established what transpired following her final known interaction. This parallel analysis allowed investigators to maintain structured continuity between both cases, while reinforcing the importance of verifiable observation, consistent documentation, and procedural accuracy. Each point of similarity was carefully recorded, serving as an organized reference framework guiding further investigative evaluation without speculation or interpretive conclusion. All documentation produced during this phase focused solely on establishing a clear comparison between factual elements of each disappearance, including timeline sequencing, witness positioning, and geographic context. This measured approach ensured that investigative records preserved objectivity, emphasized verified detail, and maintained alignment with procedural standards governing missing child case evaluation. These principles reinforce consistency and disciplined documentation throughout review. Victor Wanetty's documented criminal history reflects a structured sequence of offenses and legal actions that informed investigative evaluation over time. His record includes multiple burglary convictions, abuse allegations, and repeated parole violations, each contributing to a detailed profile of prior conduct examined by authorities. Early records established a pattern of burglary offenses that resulted in formal charges and subsequent convictions, creating a documented foundation of criminal behavior. These offenses were followed by allegations of abuse involving his stepdaughter, which later led to a confirmed conviction for sexual assault. That conviction placed him within a monitored correctional system and subjected him to specific parole conditions upon release. After serving a portion of his sentence, Victor was formally released under parole supervision with defined restrictions governing his location and conduct. His subsequent relocation patterns demonstrated repeated non-compliance with these terms, leading to additional law enforcement attention and procedural review. He was later arrested for violating parole, prompting further evaluation of his history and movements. Records show continued engagement in behavior that breached imposed legal boundaries, resulting in repeated documentation of parole infractions. Each violation extended his involvement within the criminal justice system and contributed to an expanding official record. Throughout this period, authorities maintained comprehensive documentation detailing his progression through correctional supervision. This includes recorded timelines indicating release periods, locations of residence, and occasions where parole conditions were not adhered to according to regulatory expectations. Investigative assessments relied upon court transcripts, parole records, and procedural notes to construct a chronological overview of Victor's conduct. The emphasis remained on verified documentation without interpretive expansion beyond established facts. His sequence of documented actions demonstrated a recurring pattern of noncompliance that informed later investigative scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies reference this history to contextualize procedural decision-making and assess risk factors based on recorded behavior. Each entry within the timeline contributed to a consistent narrative outlining his repeated interactions with the justice system. This historical framework allowed investigators to evaluate his behavioral record with precision, ensuring that all referenced actions reflected verified information and legally established findings. The structured record of prior convictions, parole breaches, and confirmed offenses provided a chronological foundation for further investigative attention. All elements presented remained rooted in formal documentation and procedural verification, underscoring the importance of accurate chronology and objective reporting throughout evaluative review. Periodic reviews of his status were conducted using standardized procedures that emphasize compliance monitoring and record verification. Officials track transitions between custodial supervision and conditional release while maintaining clarity within legal documentation. Sequential updates confirmed his continued association with prior regulatory oversight. This methodical approach reinforced transparency and administrative accuracy, ensuring that all references to his conduct remained aligned with formally recorded sources. Through consistent application of procedural review, investigators preserved a coherent timeline supporting structured evaluation and historical accountability across each documented stage. These processes ensured continuity and reinforced adherence to established investigative standards and protocols. Law enforcement initiated focused monitoring operations in Florida following Victor's release, implementing structured surveillance strategies based on documented procedural planning and coordinated resource deployment. These efforts involve systematic observation, data collection, movement tracking, and visual documentation designed to record behavioral patterns in a controlled and regulated manner. Investigators maintain continuous oversight of his activities using established methods that included covert positioning, timed observation intervals, and documented movement analysis across designated locations. This monitoring process revealed consistent behavior requiring further procedural attention and reinforced the decision to continue surveillance. Recorded observations were compiled into formal reports and reviewed within departmental frameworks to ensure accuracy and compliance with legal and evidentiary standards. These records supported subsequent procedural steps leading to Victor's arrest on charges aligned with habitual offender classification. The arrest was executed according to established law enforcement protocols and marked a critical transition from surveillance monitoring to formal legal processing. Following this development, search procedures resulted in the discovery of multiple items classified as evidentiary materials. These materials were documented through standard inventory protocols and submitted for forensic review and procedural evaluation. All actions taken during this phase remained within the parameters of legal regulation and court-approved guidelines. Subsequent legal proceedings resulted in his conviction as a habitual offender, reflecting prior documented conduct and current procedural findings. Sentencing outcomes were determined through established judicial processes and entered into official court records according to statutory requirements. Throughout this entire operation, law enforcement maintained disciplined documentation practices to preserve clarity, chronology, and procedural transparency. Surveillance techniques, observational records, and arrest procedures contributed to a comprehensive administrative record that supported subsequent judicial review. All developments were treated as procedural responses to verified behavior and documented activity. Investigators ensured that each action remained aligned with regulatory standards and structured operational guidelines. This process reflected an organized approach to law enforcement monitoring, arrest execution, and legal adjudication. Every stage of the operation demonstrated procedural consistency, institutional oversight, and methodical record-keeping, supporting the final legal resolution. These measures represented structured enforcement efforts rooted in documented protocols and evidentiary accountability principles. Operational reports were periodically reviewed by supervisory officials to confirm ongoing compliance with procedural directives and documentation accuracy. This review structure ensured that all surveillance activities remained properly authorized and carefully regulated. Investigative logs captured consistent activity patterns and supported subsequent protocol alignment during each procedural transition phase. Documentation provided measurable reference points that clarified the sequence of actions undertaken by enforcement personnel. Administrative coordination remained central to ensuring operational efficiency and legal reliability throughout implementation stages. Each update reflected verified status confirmation and adherence to documentation requirements. These actions reinforced procedural discipline and preserved accountability across every observational parameter evaluated during the surveillance cycle. Such compliance maintained the integrity of investigative records and ensured that all facts remained clearly defined within established legal contexts and documented procedural structures. Structured evaluation continued under consistent official oversight. Tammy Belanger's disappearance remains officially unresolved, with no verified recovery and no conclusive determination regarding her fate. Despite extensive investigative efforts, authorities have confirmed that insufficient evidence exists to support formal prosecution or establish definitive accountability within legal standards. The prolonged absence of prosecutable material has contributed to procedural stagnation, leaving the case classified as open but inactive within investigative records. Law enforcement agencies have acknowledged that available information has not met the threshold required to bring formal charges or advance the case through judicial proceedings. This prolonged investigative uncertainty has also affected Tammy's immediate family structure. Her parents, Patricia and Nelson Belanger, experienced continued strain following her disappearance, and the cumulative effects of unresolved circumstances ultimately led to their divorce. The family dynamics shifted significantly in the years following the event, as documented administrative records reflected these changes without emotional interpretation. The investigation itself remains formally listed as unresolved, indicating that Tammy's whereabouts have not been determined and no verified explanation has been confirmed. Investigators continue to recognize the absence of physical evidence, eyewitness confirmation, or direct corroboration supporting conclusive findings. Official documentation emphasizes that while previous investigative connections and procedural reviews were conducted, they did not yield sufficient substantiation for prosecution. The case therefore persists in an unresolved status, reflecting the limitations of the existing evidentiary framework. This classification has remained consistent within formal records, reinforcing the procedural reality that meaningful advancement has not occurred. Investigative oversight continues to recognize the unresolved nature of the case, acknowledging the absence of judicial closure or definitive resolution. Despite ongoing recognition of its status, no new validated developments have altered the case's official standing. Administrative review consistently confirms the continued classification of the disappearance as unsolved, with no verified recovery, no legal determination, and no updated evidentiary progression. The enduring lack of prosecutable findings has defined the structural response to Tammy's disappearance over time. All documented outcomes remain limited to procedural acknowledgement rather than conclusive determination. This structured reporting approach maintains factual consistency, ensuring records reflect the unresolved condition without speculation or emotional expansion. The continued unresolved designation demonstrates the institutional recognition that the case has not reached a judicial conclusion. Family impact documentation remains confined to structural changes, including marital separation, without interpretive narrative. The case record thereby reflects both investigative stagnation and familial alteration within strictly factual parameters, highlighting the ongoing absence of resolution. Case administrators continue to retain the file within active archival systems, preserving all prior documentation for potential future reference. Periodic status reviews reaffirm that no additional verified information has surfaced to modify existing conclusions. The unresolved designation remains in effect as authorities maintain procedural readiness should new substantiated leads emerge. All commentary regarding the case continues to emphasize documented facts only, reflecting a consistent commitment to accuracy, legal precision, and structural clarity throughout every formal acknowledgement related to Tammy Belanger's continued unresolved disappearance status confirmed. Tammy Belanger's disappearance remains officially classified as unresolved, with no confirmed recovery and no verified explanation establishing what occurred after she left her home that November morning. Investigative authorities continue to maintain that the case has not reached a conclusive outcome within legal or evidentiary standards. Victor Wanetty, who had been identified as a suspect during the investigation, later died while in custody, and his death closed any further possibility of direct questioning or legal clarification regarding his potential involvement. Despite his prior designation within procedural documentation, no forensic proof ever emerged confirming a definitive link between him and Tammy's disappearance. Law enforcement records continue to reflect that no physical evidence, conclusive witness testimony, or scientifically verified findings have established responsibility for the disappearance. The absence of forensic confirmation has prevented judicial proceedings from moving forward and has reinforced the classification of the case as unsolved. The official status of the investigation remains open in principle, acknowledging that unresolved cases may be subject to review should new verified information become available. However, as of the most recent documented assessments, no substantiated developments have altered the standing conclusion that Tammy's whereabouts remain unknown. This designation reflects the procedural reality that no direct evidence has been obtained to conclusively explain the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. All investigative conclusions continue to emphasize the same foundational position maintained since initial review, namely, that no verified resolution exists. Administrative records consistently identify Victor's death as a closed event, unrelated to procedural advancement regarding Tammy's case, and no additional legal determinations were pursued following that occurrence. Thus, the investigation retains its unresolved classification while maintaining structured documentation integrity. The continued absence of forensic verification sustains the formal acknowledgement that no definitive explanation has ever been established. Each official reference reiterates that Tammy's disappearance remains unexplained, and that investigative closure has not been achieved. In accordance with established investigative conclusions, the case remains open in principle. Law enforcement continues to preserve all documentation in the event future evidence might emerge, but no current material meets the necessary standards for reopening or resolution. This final status reflects a disciplined commitment to factual accuracy and procedural transparency, ensuring that no speculative conclusions are introduced into formal record. Tammy Belanger's case, therefore, continues to remain unresolved, with her disappearance officially recognized as unsolved due to the persistent absence of verified explanatory findings or conclusive forensic association. Investigators have reiterated that the unresolved designation will remain unchanged until credible evidence satisfies established forensic and legal thresholds required for formal determination. No subsequent review has produced material capable of redefining the case status or supporting measurable advancement toward resolution. Consequently, official communications continue to confirm that Tammy's disappearance persists as an open and unresolved matter, documented within investigative archives as lacking confirmed explanation, verified linkage, or legally actionable proof sufficient to redefine its standing conclusion within procedural assessment frameworks currently under review.